all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Welcome to Veterans Radio. I am Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today. We've got some great programs for you. I think you'll find very interesting. We always want to remind you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or by going to veteransradio.net, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.net. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We also want to thank Eisenhower Center. It's a brain injury recovery center. Learn more about eisenhowercenter.com. They're located in Michigan and in Florida. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. Contact us if you'd like to be a sponsor on Veterans Radio, and let's move on to our program. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today Colonel James J. Coolican. He is a U.S. Marine retired colonel, and we're going to have an interesting conversation about the Legion of Valor, which I don't think we've ever talked about on Veterans Radio. So, Jim, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, as I said, we want to talk specifically about something that you're involved in, the Legion of Valor. But before we get there, how did a nice kid like you from Pennsylvania end up doing a career in the Marines?
Well, I was in college in Philadelphia, and of course, when I was a young guy, there was a draft, so everybody was going to serve. And I was in the Air Force ROTC, which was required in those days for the first 2 years of college at my university. And I chose to stay in the what they call the advanced part of it, which means you'd be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force when you finished. And I did that. And then when I came back to start my junior year, they gathered all of us together because now you're part of the team. And they told us that there's such a backlog of lieutenants in the Air Force that we wouldn't be called for 2 to 3 years. And I thought, I can't afford to sit around for 2 or 3 years, so I dropped out. Not realizing that when I did that, I lost my deferment. And I got a draft notice.
Well, they didn't tell you that up front, did they? When they called you all together, they didn't say this is what's going to happen.
No. I just assumed that it was okay for everybody. So anyhow, I got a draft notice, and I thought it was a mistake because I assumed if you're in college, you had a deferment. Well, without getting into all the details, that wasn't the case. So I was told that I had two choices. I could either report to Fort Dix, New Jersey in December, or I could join another branch of the service before that date. So I went back to Philadelphia, and I went to the old courthouse at 13th and Chestnut, where all the recruiters were located. My goal was to join anything that let me stay in college. So the first office was the Marine Corps, and they had a program that you joined while you're in college. You did your training during the summer, and when you graduated, if you kept a certain academic average, you'd be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps for 3 years. So I thought that worked, and that's what I did, and it turned out to be a much longer career than 3 years.
You didn't read the fine print in that contract they had just signed.
No. Well, my goal was to stay in college because I was in a basketball scholarship. And, of course, if I left college, most likely I would never get back.
And was there a particular field of study that you were going towards?
Well, at the school that I went to, we all had to have a major in philosophy and then another major. So I majored in philosophy and also management.
Okay, well, I don't know if the philosophy was going to help that much in your military career, but this wasn't supposed to be a career. You were just doing your 3 years, and then you'd be out. But obviously things changed. What, as you started out in that first tour, tell us a little bit about the beginning of your Marine Corps career.
Well, in the Marine Corps, unlike the other services, we don't consider anything that is pre-commissioning as training. It's just screening to see who we want to commission as lieutenants. And then after you commissioned, you attended a 5-month course at Quantico, Virginia, called the Basic School. And that's where you're really trained to be a Marine officer. And then that's where you get your specialty, and I requested infantry, and that's what I got. So after that, I joined an infantry battalion in Camp Pendleton, trained for a few months, and then we deployed to the Far East for 13 months. Come back from that and was at Camp Pendleton, and my 3 years was coming to an end, so I took some time off and had some interviews, and I realized that I enjoyed the Marine Corps a lot more than I thought I did. So instead of working for some company or corporation, I stayed in the Marine Corps. And I got married and did work for my wife and family, so it just continued on.
Well, certainly that this was the time of the Vietnam draft, and that first tour was a lot of guys experienced. But it really is at that third year mark where you can get out and you're thinking about getting out. Mm-hmm. How did your family react? How did your friends react to say, you're staying in? What are you, nuts? what was the temperament back then?
Well, of course, my father, we lived in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, and all the men worked in the coal mines, and it was really an interesting situation because growing up as a child or as a kid, even as a teenager, I lived in a small town of maybe 2,000 people, and again, all the men worked in the coal mines. And the thing that was interesting is that there was nobody wealthy or poor because everybody had a job working in the coal mines and got about the same amount of money. So that was kind of normal. And then after World War II, oil became the fuel of choice for heating homes as compared to coal, and the coal mines went down, and it became a very depressed area. So most of the young men then my age and my brother's age, we all left that part of Pennsylvania and went elsewhere. So it was kind of an interesting career. I think my mother was less enthused about it because, she was a woman who went to the 8th grade as my father went to the 10th grade. So things were kind of, I guess you'd say those people at that time didn't have what we would call joy. For them, it was survival because, they grew up in the Depression, had World War II, and then the economy in that part of Pennsylvania went down. So they looked upon life as having security, like being a police officer or being a school teacher or being an insurance salesman, something like that. So having one of their sons decide to stay in the Marine Corps was a little bit different, but I think they accepted it and they recognized it. And then shortly after that, the Vietnam War started, and it just kind of went on from there. And I had my father was in World War II, and then a younger brother who also was in Vietnam about the same time as I was. So it just became a natural thing at that time.
And did your brother serve in the Army, or did the Air Force snag him? They lost one boy. Maybe they got the other one.
No, unfortunately, he was in the Army, and he was wounded very seriously on the battlefield, and they had to give him transfusions. And this was before they tested blood, and unfortunately, he got bad blood. So he eventually recovered from the wounds, but he subsequently passed away from blood poisoning and hepatitis.
Well, I think people don't understand often sort of how challenging military medicine was, yes, and still is, although it's improved so much. And a lot of what we have in civilian medicine is because of what was learned in through military medicine, and this is probably a good example of that.
Yes, it is. Yes, very much so.
So it sounds like, Jim, that the military provided economic opportunity, ability to travel some, maybe educational opportunity that just wasn't going to be available in the coal mine area of Pennsylvania.
Well, I went to college in Philadelphia, and of course, when you're growing up, you know what you know. You don't know anything else. And when I went to Philadelphia, I realized that there's a different life than the coal mines. And after the first year, I knew I was not going back to the coal mines.
And as you were, talk to us through the progression of your career in the military, additional assignments, those sorts of things.
Well, I was an infantry officer, and the Marine Corps, of course, is a smaller service than the other services. And the other services provide a lot of services to the Marine Corps. For example, the Navy provides all of our doctors, dentists, chaplains. The Army helps us when we need new equipment in terms of developing it and so forth. The Air Force helps us with refueling of our aircraft. So the Marine Corps is much more focused on combat than the other services might be, simply because they provide services to us that we don't have to replicate in a non-combat fashion. So typically in the Marine Corps, my specialty was infantry, which is very intense, obviously. And typically what happens for officers is you go through your career, you usually have one tour of duty in the infantry, then you have another tour of duty doing something else. So like, for example, during my career, I trained lieutenants at the basic school that I mentioned before. I taught at the Naval Academy. I did an assignment in Italy at a NATO headquarters and things like that. So you do a lot of other things as well. Like, for example, my wife is a school teacher, and she stopped teaching school after our children were born, then went back to teaching after they went to school. And my wife taught in 8 school districts and 3 universities in 6 countries during our time in the Marine Corps.
Holy cow, she had a heck of a career, didn't she?
She did.
That's extraordinary.
She probably served more in the Marine Corps than I did.
Well, as we all know, and Jim knows that my spouse served for a while as well, you can't have a career in the military without the support of your family.
That's right, yes. In fact, when I would train lieutenants, my point to them was, if you're married, your spouse has to be ready for this. And if not, then you've got 2 choices. Because it's a very involved process for the family, and I think that the families serve more than the individuals wearing the uniform, because they don't get the recognition that we do, but they have to suffer all the difficulties of it. Like, for example, when I was in Vietnam, I was wounded, and my wife was notified the next day, and about 4 or 5 days after that, our son, who was 17 months old, had emergency brain surgery. So, it's a difficult process for the families.
Yeah, no doubt about it. They sacrifice greatly. Jim, give us the time frame here. When did you get commissioned, and when did you retire?
I'm sorry, Jim.
When did you get commissioned, and what year did you retire?
I was commissioned in June of 1960. And I retired in October of 1990.
That just helps frame it for our listeners. And we're talking to Colonel James J. Coolican, Marine, retired, about his experience in the military. But we're going to turn now to an organization that he is the past commander of, and it's the Legion of Valor. I don't know that people outside a small circle really know what the Legion of Valor is about. So, Jim, why don't you educate the Veteran Radio listeners?
Sure. Yeah, the Legion of Valor, first of all, it's the longest standing military organization we have. It was founded in about 1890 by the Civil War veterans and the American Indian War veterans. And originally it was for the individuals who had the Medal of Honor. And then it expanded out to individuals who had the next award, which would be the Service Cross, such as the Navy Cross, Air Force Cross, or Distinguished Service Cross. So the Legion of Valor is made up of individuals who have the Medal of Honor and any of those other 3 awards. Now, in the early 1900s, around 1910, the Medal of Honor Association started. So now it's 2 kind of distinct organizations in that you have the Medal of Honor and Legion of Valor. Now, we do have a few members still in the Legion of Valor who have the Medal of Honor, and they're in both associations. But for the most part, the Medal of Honor Association stands, and then we have the Legion of Valor. And it's a small organization because obviously, you have to have one of those top 2 awards. And our objectives, and then what happened is as years went on, first it was the Medal of Honor, and then the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. Then later on, the Navy Cross was added, and then finally the Air Force Cross was added to it. So we meet once a year, and the commander decides the location where it's going to be. So this coming year, we'll be meeting in meeting in Williamsburg, Virginia. And our goals are to continue the memories of the active duty and retired and reserve members of the armed forces. We want to promote fellowship among them. We want to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunities for the armed forces to serve our country. And then we also want to make sure that we stimulate patriotism in the minds of our young and individuals. So, for example, we give awards every year to the cadets in the ROTCs. We also have a civilian award, which is called the Silver Cross for Heroism, and we award that to anybody who saved somebody's life. Now, that can be anybody in the country, and then we make them associate members of the. Now, the difficulty is, as with the Medal of Honor, the opportunity for individuals to receive those awards has gone down dramatically. So we're kind of running out of guys and gals in some cases who have those awards. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, the Navy Marine Corps awarded approximately 400 Navy Crosses, and about 2/3 of those were posthumous awards. And during the entire time we've been fighting in the Middle East, we've only awarded 24 Navy Crosses, and probably half of those were posthumous. So we're coming to a situation now where we're probably looking at how do we kind of close down the active part of our services, but be able to continue it on through other means.
Well, it's an organization, as you say, that's been around since 1890.
Yes,
and,
right.
And it holds a special place because the Distinguished Service Crosses recognize, acts of real valor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's, a lot of different reasons. One maybe doesn't get the Medal of Honor, but and that can range from, command structure to just, hey, I was just doing my job. I don't want to participate any further or two. And there's been times, certainly Congress has investigated bias or discrimination in giving out the Medal of Honor. Sure. But this Distinguished Service Cross is a very noteworthy military award, and there's a lot to be learned, I think, from those who have received the Distinguished Service Cross about what they're willing to do for their comrades and their country. So it has to be a really amazing group of men and women who get together annually for these conferences, Jim.
It is, and I'd like to, if you don't mind, Jim, just take a minute to talk about a young man from Michigan who received the Distinguished Service Cross with me. His name is Frank Doezema. That's Doezema. Frank was from Kalamazoo, Michigan. A young man, finished high school in 1967, and his goal was to continue living and working on the farm with his brothers and his parents. But in 67, of course, we were at war, and there's a draft. So Frank volunteered to be drafted, and which is a very popular thing for young men to do when the draft is on, because if you were drafted, you served for 2 years. If you enlisted, you enlisted for 3 or 4 years. So a lot of young men would volunteer to be drafted so they could go for 2 years and then go back and continue their life in the civilian world. So Frank, after basic training, was sent to be a field radio operator, and then to Vietnam, and he became my radio operator. Now, people may wonder why you'd have a Marine having an Army guy as a radio operator. Well, during the Vietnam War, we had advisors with all of the Vietnamese units, battalions, and above. And they were mostly Marines and mostly soldiers and some Marines with them. So I was one of the advisors, and Frank was my radio operator. And on the morning of the Tet Offensive in Hue City, which would have been December 31st of 1968, there's a 4-day ceasefire, and the ceasefires, for the most part, were honored by both sides, and there'd be Vietnamese holidays and American holidays like Christmas and 4th of July and so forth. And there's a 4-day ceasefire, and the North Vietnamese launched an attack in South Vietnam, and in the city of Hue, they come in with 10,000 soldiers. And our unit was there, but there was no American units in Hue, and only a few of the South Vietnamese. And Frank Dozimer grabbed a machine gun and raced to a tower in front of our position. And that brave young soldier bought us a few minutes of time and saved a lot of lives. And he was seriously wounded. So I went to get him, and I brought him back. And he was seriously wounded, and I knew he was going to die. But I gave him 2 shots of morphine before I carried him back. And I knelt down next to him when he was on the ground when the medics were taking care of him. And I said, Frank, we're going to get you out of here. And when I come home, I'll come to Kalamazoo to see you. But then I said, Frank, I've got to go now. And before I could leave, in almost a whisper, he just said, take care of our guys. And that young man, I think, represents the American veterans, because his only concern, even though he was dying, his only concern was to make sure he took care of his buddies. And Frank was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star, and of course the Purple Heart. And he's buried in a small country cemetery up in Kalamazoo.
And you can't listen to the story of Frank Dozimer without having chills run down your spine. These are important stories and pieces of history not to be lost. And unfortunately, we live in a time where nobody teaches any history at all, let alone any personal accounts. And it's the personal accounts that really make, whether it's the Vietnam War or the fighting in Korea or in Afghanistan or Iraq, come to life and be something that folks can relate to. So I think it's really important that the Legion of Honor, works at preserving these stories and telling these pieces of history so that it just doesn't all evaporate and get lost.
Yes, that's true. In fact, recognizing that our organization is getting older and moving on, we are having the history of the Legion of Valor written at this time. And I hope that by next year at this time, we'll have it published.
Well, that's a great forward-thinking move.
It was interesting when we decided to do that. Excuse me. There's a rather famous author by the name of Mark Bowden, and Mark did Black Hawk Down and also Hawaii 1968, which is about the battle for the Tet Offensive. So when we got ready to do our history, I contacted Mark and said, what do we need to make sure we include in here? And he said, you have to have oral histories. Because he said, typically the military guys and gals don't talk about it, and it just kind of fades away. And he said, what you have to do, you have to preserve that. And he, and because of him now, in our new book coming out, we'll have a lot of oral histories about individuals with the Medal of Honor and the Legion of Valor. Because again, it's true that most of them don't talk about what they did.
Well, we tell a lot of these stories on Veterans Radio, and I, as an interviewer, and I'm recognizing the moment now where I'm not getting the story, because almost every one of these guys, and certainly if you talk to a Medal of Honor person or somebody with the Distinguished Service Cross, you're going to tell me you were just doing your job. And your concern is never about getting an award or being recognized. It's about your buddies. It's about your men. And yes. Jim, you are a member of the Legion of Valor because you've received the Distinguished Service Cross as well. Give us the thumbnail of that. I know you don't want to, and you're going to tell me you're just doing your job, but we have to preserve the history, as you just said.
Well, first of all, I had the choice of getting the Distinguished Service Cross or the Navy Cross, and I chose the Navy Cross just because of my background, obviously. But it really had to do with the Battle of Hawaii City during the Tet Offensive, and it was a 28-day battle, so it was very difficult to summarize it. Other than we were attacked by 10,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, and through the really, really, really good hard work of the Vietnamese military and the United States military, we won that battle.
Well, and more so, Jim, you were subjected to, as others were, intense small arms fire, B-40 rockets. You often during that period had to disregard your own safety and move rapidly to various guard posts and men who were hurt. There's a history of your experiences laid out in the Legion of Valor website. you don't get the Navy Cross for just doing your job either. It is a recognition of acts of valor that, again, need to be told. People have to understand that men for decades have been willing to make these kind of sacrifices, and a country has to hope that in the future men will also make those sacrifices, don't they?
Yes, and Jim, I believe they will, because excuse me, certainly anybody who got awards deserved and all that. The problem is that we have thousands and thousands more men and women who deserve those awards who didn't get them, and I think we have to keep that in mind as well, because when you look at the American people from the time of George Washington up to the present time, when our country was in peril, young men and women came forward and said, "I'll serve." And when I think of different times in our history, and you think of how good they were in World War II or elsewhere, the thing is they were good in all the wars. We just recognize some more than others, but the American veteran is the unsung hero of the United States, because when you look at every single conflict, young men and women came forward and said, "I'll serve." And I don't think we can honor the veterans enough. And that's why on Veterans Day, it's a national holiday, but veterans don't celebrate Veterans Day. On Veterans Day, we do two things. We first of all honor those veterans who are no longer with us. And secondly, we remember those veterans we served with. And in many cases, you never see them again because of time or distance, but you never forget them. You remember them forever.
Absolutely. I'm going to circle back to where you just started a minute ago, which was there are a lot more folks who deserve these recognitions than actually get them. And there's been articles over the last, certainly 5 or 10 years talking about how few Distinguished Service Crosses have been issued in this global war on terror, and how is that because there isn't this act of valor going on, or is there some DOD bias on this, or some other unspoken concern about elevating these awards? Have you, as part of the Legion of Valor, thought about how the heck can there be so few of these? What's going on?
Well, I suppose there are a lot of reasons, Jim, but I think, first of all, something has to happen. In other words, you have to do something, and then somebody has to see it, and then third, somebody has to write it up. And all those things don't happen all the time. In fact, most of the times they don't happen all that. In the Middle East recently were much different than the typical conflicts we had in the past, because, we were able to put bases there that were almost like being back home. We have McDonald's and we have gymnasiums and so forth, and they'll be there for a couple of days and they'll go out on a mission, and they in tough, hard fighting for 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 days, then go back again to living on the base. So I don't think it was the same kind of war, and I don't think people had the chance to observe as much as they did in the past. But I think when you look at certainly the military men and women who have served in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, their heroism is certainly as great, if not more, than anything that we experienced. Because for me, like in Vietnam, every day was the same. We were in combat and just kind of pushing it on, and there's a lot more opportunities for people to observe what you're doing as compared to, I think, in the Middle East. But I don't think there's anything that was deliberate that caused the fact that we have fewer awards. I think it was just the circumstances that were different. But I think the service and valor was the same.
No, I agree. I think the service and valor is the same. I think you've hit the point where the war now that we've fought in the war on terror, there's smaller units or forward operating bases. There's much less command eyes on. And so it may not be seen, and certainly there's nobody out there with a pen and piece of paper writing this stuff down, right? So you don't have the same sort of backroom admin support at headquarters, maybe. Right. So it's interesting to think about it in that context, and just wonder whether or not the country is doing a disservice by not maybe opening that up and recognizing that a little bit more. So
I certainly think that Our enlisted men do most of the fighting, and I think certainly for them we should be doing more recognition of what they do as compared to what, say, the officers do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's again sort of a history of that debate about who should get awards and should the officers get them or should they only be for the enlisted or vice versa. That's kind of gone both ways. But Jim Coolican, Colonel, retired from the United States Marine Corps after 30 years. If folks want to know more about the Legion of Valor, is there a public website that they can go look at?
Yes, if they just go to the legionofvalor.com, they'll get it. And also, we have a very good museum in Fresno, California. And if you had a chance to visit Fresno, that's a great thing to see. But also, you can access our website for the museum. And it's a great place that covers all of our history, because all of our history that we have in terms of memorabilia is at the museum. And also, I would also, Jim, before we close, I'd like to just congratulate our military men and women who fought in Afghanistan. And we welcome them home. They did a magnificent job. We're proud of them, and they all deserve our recognition and credit. And certainly the 13 service members who lost their lives in the last couple of days of the battle.
Absolutely, and we should remind all Americans, everybody listening to Veterans Radio, that we've been kept safe for these 20 years as well.
Yes, right.
No such attacks in the homeland, so that's why we were fighting what we were doing. So I also want to say that your website has a great list of books that talk to heroic and valor events surrounding folks who have the Distinguished Service Cross or Navy Cross or Air Force Cross. So again, if you want more on this subject, you want to know more about the Legion of Valor, go to the website, look at the museum, look at some of the books that they have posted up. I think you'll find it real interesting. And Jim, we're going to be interested in hearing from you a year from now when the Legion of Valor has its oral history book out.
Yes, and also we're going to put it online when it comes out, so everyone will have access to it.
Well, that's great, and thank you for spending some time today with Veterans Radio.
I enjoyed it, Jim. Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows by going to veteransradio.net. And until next time, you are dismissed.
If you have a VA claim denied by the Board of Veterans Appeals, contact Legal Help for Veterans at 1-800-693-4800. They're experts in handling cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. Their number again, 1-800-693-4800.
We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org, Eisenhower Center, VA Ann Arbor Health Care System, the Vietnam Veterans of America Charles S. Kettles Chapter, Ann Arbor, Michigan, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423 in Ann Arbor, and the American Legion Presscorn Post 46, also in Ann Arbor. They keep us on the air, as does your support. Go to Facebook, go to veteransradio.net, and support our efforts. And until next time, you are dismissed.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.